So I started out very interested in gender and men's and women's roles. So I was doing a project on that for my undergraduate honors thesis. And one of the measures that I was using was on masculine and feminine traits, so stereotypical things like assertiveness and leadership, say, on the masculine scale, and found that the women there in the 90s were scoring much higher on that scale than the 1970s test manual said that they should. That wasn't the topic of my thesis, but I finished up my thesis and started realizing this might be an even better topic to move forward with in research, is thinking about cultural change and generational change. So that was the first generational change study that I published, was women scoring higher on traits like assertiveness and leadership.
And what does that mean?
Assertiveness and leadership and these stereotypically masculine traits, it basically is a reflection of women speaking up more, speaking their minds,
being.
It's a good thing. Well, yes and no. So that's where it got interesting, actually. So at first I thought it was entirely a good thing, thinking that you have more equality, that women are entering the workforce, that women are entering professions, taking their place in terms of what their intelligence and their work ethic, what they deserved, and not to be discriminated against, and not to be told that they can't do this. So I thought that was a good thing, and that personality change was a good outcome of that, of women being more assertive and embracing these traits that are rewarded in the workplace. But as my work went on, I started to look at things like self-esteem and eventually narcissism, and realized that there's a bright side and a dark side to this cultural trend of individualism, which basically means focusing more on the self and less on social rules and others. So the positive of that is gender equality and racial equality, and more acknowledgement of the rights of gays and lesbians and all of these great things. Or we have same-sex marriage, and we don't have as much hatred as we used to, which is wonderful. That we have less prejudice, more tolerance, more equality. This is the upside. This is the wonderful part of individualism. But if it's taken too far, and there's too much focus on the self and an inflated sense of self, and then where there's not as much consideration for others, then it can cross the line into narcissism, and that's where you get some of this more dark side of the cultural trend.
What happened after that? Tell me.
That gender project, and I had a few of those, and then looked at self-esteem, and it was just starting to come out that self-esteem was fine, but that it was not the cure-all that many people thought it was going to be, that it actually wasn't really linked to success, that it wasn't linked to really much, that as long as you have a basic sense of self, thinking really highly of yourself doesn't actually help you succeed. That it may protect a little against depression, but it doesn't really have all these good outcomes people really expected it to. So that started to show that there might be kind of two sides to this picture. And just it kind of kept coming up that there were some of these good trends and then some of these bad trends. That individualism had these consequences, like more anxiety and depression happened as well. You wouldn't expect that if people were feeling good about themselves, and why would there be more anxiety and depression? Well, it's because the self isn't a great basis for mental health. So that was a next step in seeing some of the more negative consequences of too much self-focus.
And you see it as a really massive problem coming through, right?
Well, I think that the individualism has so many benefits that I don't think we should go back to the 50s, which is, people sometimes misinterpret me as saying that's what we should do, but not at all. And I also think that's a big strength of the young generation. So I call them Generation Me. That's one of their biggest strengths. And the longest chapter in Generation Me, my book, is on equality. But there's also these downsides. I think the culture has shifted in a way that has really done a disservice to young people in telling them that they're special, in setting up very high expectations, yet not emphasizing getting along with others and self-control and hard work as much as it should, focusing on money and fame and image rather than the more bedrock values that seem old-fashioned but actually work, like work ethic and self-control and consideration for others.
I see it in my kids' classrooms. The little ones in particular are not being told to just sit down and shut up, ever. And I don't know why. Parents must be parenting differently, right?
They seem to be. So in writing The Narcissism Epidemic, that was one of the things we tried to do, my co-author and I, was to try to find good data on the changes in parenting over time. And it was a miserable failure, really, because there's very, very little out there. We found a lot of empirical evidence for all kinds of other aspects of cultural change, but it was really hard to find anything on parenting. We found one thing, and it does seem to suggest that there has been a movement toward more permissive parenting. So the one thing we found was a good survey, big survey had been done for a long time. And it asked people to rate, qualities they thought were good for children to have. And some of them hadn't changed at all, but one really declined a lot, and it was a child who is obedient, that the value placed on that has gone down. Now, that's not entirely a bad thing. We do want kids to think for themselves.
A bit.
Yeah, right. And isn't that it?
Not when I'm
right. And not when I've told you to do something. I know. And I have 3 kids myself, so I run into this all the time. That we want them to be creative, and we want them to make decisions and to be their own people. On the other hand, when we tell them to put their shoes away, we want them to put their shoes away and not argue about it and not come up with their own ideas on why they should leave their shoes in the middle of the floor.
So where does that take us? If that's what's going on, what is the result of that?
So I think the result of that, and there is good data on this, the result of that type of more permissive parenting, putting the child on a pedestal, giving lots of praise, being very permissive and not really having a lot of rules. What you get generally with that type of parenting, you get more narcissism. So there's 4 or 5 studies that point in that direction. Not definitive, but they all point in that general direction.
So when you tell kids they're awesome all the time, they don't need, they're special, that results in narcissism.
Yes. It may also result in inflated expectations, because those have also increased over time too. At that same time that we've seen those shifts in parenting. And this is a tough one, because it's good to have high expectations and we want our kids to aim high. But when so many of them are aiming for fame, and then the others are all saying, well, everybody's going to be a doctor or a lawyer, that's not going to happen. And it may not even be the best path for them, too, even more importantly. So there's going to be a lot of disappointment. And that's what the data seem to suggest has happened.
Do you have a solution? Please say yes. Because I've got 3 of these little beasts running around. Nice ones.
Yes. So we don't need to tell our kids that they're special. What we should say instead is, I love you. It's usually what parents mean anyway when they say you're special. But it's so much of a better message.
That's so gorgeous.
Then it's about connection. It's about love. Then it's not something that has to do with comparing yourselves to other people. If you say I love you, then it's okay if their teacher doesn't necessarily think that they're special out of the 30 kids in the class.
Because they're not.
Because they know. Right, they can't be. And so then you're not setting them up for that. But then they know that they can always count on your love. And so that's always there. But then, of course, it shouldn't be blind love. That we have to think long term with our kids and not just short term. That, if the child isn't behaving and is not doing what they need to do, that if you love them, that doesn't mean you indulge them and say, oh, go do whatever you want and not punish them for anything wrong. No, because you love them, you want to think about long term that they have to accept responsibility, and you want to raise them to be an adult who will take responsibility and take care of themselves and all of these important things. And so I'm not suggesting being overly harsh. For example, we know from really good data that spanking is not a good idea, leads to aggression, doesn't work, but having limits for behavior and having kids know that they need to meet these expectations. And that is done from a place of love, or it should be done from a place of love. And I think for most parents it is.
And are you getting a pushback against this message?
I do, yeah. It's
because it's a bit it's a bit out of step with my understanding of what's trendy.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. So, in both the U.S. and Australia, there's a lot of individualism. It's taken almost as gospel that believing in yourself is the key to success. Self-esteem doesn't actually really lead to success. It doesn't actually lead to a whole lot of anything, really. It's kind of a wash. It's a disappointment. So you mentioned in this talk on self-control that's what actually does lead to success. So you look at the studies. Here's the example I always use. It's probably the easiest way to illustrate this. In the United States, the ethnic group that has the lowest self-esteem is Asian Americans. And that's actually the group that has the best academic performance for kids and the highest median income. My best guess would be the same would be true for Australia, because that's a culture that places much more emphasis on self-control and hard work and doesn't really think a whole lot about self-importance or self-belief. It's just not something that they really place a lot of emphasis on. So it may actually be the reason why performance is actually better, because they're placing the emphasis on the stuff that actually works, which is work ethic and self-control and perseverance, instead of self-belief, which just doesn't, it doesn't hurt necessarily, but it doesn't help.
I've read a little bit about the marshmallow test.
Sure.
Which I find funny. It just makes me laugh. So my understanding of that is that the kids who were able to wait for their one marshmallow, if they left it for 5 minutes, they could come back and when the person came back in, they'd get 2. My understanding of that is that the kids who could wait for 2 were better positioned later in life. Yeah. So that's really the same message you're saying.
Yeah, so that's the classic study, but there have been lots and lots and lots of studies that followed that up. That's where I was talking about it in his talk quite a bit. So that's all right, yeah. I know. So the self-control literature, also it's sometimes called conscientiousness, sometimes called willpower. It goes by a lot of names, but all of it has good outcomes. So people who have high, either in situations or just kind of from their personality, have high self-control. They have better success at work. They have an easier time in relationships because they keep themselves from saying, what they think but know they shouldn't say, for example. And lower, better physical health. Don't smoke, eat better, all of these things. It just has all of these fantastic outcomes. So if we're going to emphasize something among our kids, self-control is the best thing, not self-esteem.
Okay, so tell me about your book.
My first book was Generation Me, and I did update that, and there's a new edition of that coming out in the fall. Okay. So it was a pretty extensive update because it was almost 10 years since it came out, so a lot more data. Pop culture has changed a lot in that time period too, reality TV in particular. So about 2/3 of it is new, but that won't be out till October.
I have to get that because I need to read that.
Yeah. So it was fun to put all the new studies in there and all the more extensive stuff. And I also now heard all the counter arguments. Yeah. So that was another goal, particularly in the introduction. But mostly just many more studies. So when I published the first book, had a lot of data, but it was from children and university students. There wasn't quite as much from adults. There wasn't quite as much from high school students. There wasn't quite as much from really large samples. And now all of that data has become available online. So I started to publish journal articles on that. So featured a lot of that in the book too. So we just know, and about many more topics. So I know a lot more. And then so 3 years after that book, I did the narcissism epidemic with my friend Keith Campbell. He's done more research on narcissism than anybody else in terms of publications and journal articles. So we kind of combined forces on that. We had both done postdocs together and met there, and did the first study I did on changes in narcissism was with him and some other colleagues, because I was doing stuff on cultural change, she was doing stuff on narcissism, so that made a natural collaboration. So cultural change and narcissism.
And are they selling well? Are people liking the message?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly controversy, and there's certainly some people, I suppose, to an extent. I would say for the most part, I think that the most gratifying thing for me is people who said, I really enjoyed reading the book. It was fun to read, that, liked the examples, and that was really my goal. And also to hear from young people who said, I started out the book kind of with my arms crossed, not so sure what you were going to say, but they'll say, but I really, those examples you talked about in the culture, that was my childhood. I did really recognize it. And then they sometimes when they're talking to me, they even kind of start out with this posture, and then they'll kind of relax and then say, then I realized that a lot of this really is true. And sometimes it's tough to hear, but a lot of that really resonated. And so that's been gratifying too.
Yeah. Mindfulness, your understanding of how mindfulness can help.
Mindfulness is complex, obviously, as you know, but it can play a role in a lot of these things that we're talking about. So first, there's some evidence to suggest that meditation and mindfulness can increase self-control. The other thing is the whole philosophy behind mindfulness and meditation, and its Buddhist and Hindu roots, is about consideration for others. So I was talking to Matthew about this, Matthew Ricard, and he was saying that he actually thinks it shouldn't just be mindfulness, it should be caring mindfulness. And I think that's wonderful. That's a real, it's a good antidote against narcissism. Because, so what I said at the end of my talk is that I think one of the best things to emphasize instead of self-esteem and narcissism is perspective taking and empathy and compassion. And that's what mindfulness is really all about. That it seems like kind of a paradox, because you'd think, oh, mindfulness means, it's about the self and but it's not. When it's done right, it's not.
Yeah.
It's really about, sure, you have to calm your mind, but that you calm your mind enough so it's not all about you anymore. That's the real key. So that's where I think it can play a role.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.